My sister told me. My eyes meant nothing because I was just a programmer, then demanded I give her daughter my cornea, so her modeling career could survive. You don't even need both eyes, Priya said. You stare at a screen all day. I stood in my kitchen in Denver, phone pressed to my ear, a mug of coffee going cold on the counter. It was February 3rd, a Saturday. I had been awake for 11 minutes. Say that again, I said. Sophie needs a cornea transplant, Emma. You're a match. You're the obvious choice. I'm a match. So are you. You're her mother. She laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a real one. Like I'd said something absurd. I can't lose an eye. I'm a model. My face is my income. Yours is a laptop and a keyboard. Nobody's paying you to look a certain way. I set the mug down harder than I meant to. Coffee sloshed over the rim. She's 9 years old, Priya. I know how old my daughter is. Then donate your own cornea. The line went quiet for a second. Then her voice came back flat, almost bored, like she'd rehearsed this part. It's not that simple. You know it's not. Just think about it. That's all I'm asking. She hung up before I could answer. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that, staring at the spilled coffee, feeling something in my chest go cold and still. I didn't know yet that this was only the first call. I didn't know there would be dozens more. I didn't know my sister had already written my name on a hospital form 3 weeks earlier, before she'd ever asked me a single question. I'm 35. I've worked as a software engineer for 11 years, the last 6 at a fintech company called Meridian Systems, where I lead a team of 8 people who build fraud detection tools for regional banks. I have a mortgage on a 2-bedroom house in the Highlands neighborhood. I have a dog named Bishop, a rescue mutt with one ear that never stands upright. I have a life I built slowly and carefully, on my own terms, and until that February morning, I would have told you my sister was a difficult person, but not a dangerous one. Priya is 3 years older than me. She started modeling at 19, local print work in Sacramento, catalog shoots for department stores that don't exist anymore. By 24, she'd signed with a mid-tier agency in Los Angeles called Vantage Model Management. It was never the career she describes when she tells people about it now. There was no cover of Vogue, there was no runway in Milan, there were skincare ads, a regional furniture campaign, 3 years as the face of a chain of tanning salons that got shut down after a lawsuit. She made decent money in good years and almost nothing in bad ones. And she married Victor, a hedge fund analyst 12 years older than her, when she was 28. Victor's money is the reason she can still call herself a model, without worrying whether the checks come in. Sophie was born the year I turned 29. I remember holding her in the hospital in Culver City, this small, furious person with more hair than any baby has a right to have, and feeling something shift in my chest that I hadn't expected. I loved her instantly and completely, in a way that had nothing to do with my sister at all. Our parents, Raj and Meena, still live in the house in Sacramento where Priya and I grew up. My father worked 31 years as a civil engineer for the state before he retired. My mother taught middle school math for almost as long. They are not wealthy people. They are careful people, the kind who paid off their mortgage early and drove the same Honda for 14 years. And from as far back as I can remember, they treated Priya's face like it was a family asset that needed protecting. When Priya got a sunburn at 15, my mother acted like the house was on fire. When I broke my wrist falling off my bike the same summer, nobody took me to urgent care until my father got home from work 4 hours later. I'm not telling you this to make my childhood sound like a tragedy. It wasn't. I had food, clothes, a bedroom, parents who loved me in their own limited way. But there was always a hierarchy in that house, and Priya was at the top of it, and by the time we were adults, that hierarchy had calcified into something nobody questioned out loud. There's an incident from 2019 that I didn't think much about at the time, but that I've turned over in my head 100 times since. Priya called me in October that year, right before Thanksgiving, asking to borrow $12,000. She said it was for a new headshot package and a dermatology consultation, something about a big audition for a national campaign, and she needed to look flawless. I had just gotten a raise that year, my base salary crossing 6 figures for the first time, and I remember feeling almost embarrassed by how much money I suddenly had compared to what I'd grown up with. I wired her the $12,000 2 days later. I never saw a dollar of it again, and I never got the campaign update she promised to send me. When I asked about it the following spring, she told me the audition fell through and changed the subject. That Thanksgiving, at my parents' table, my mother mentioned, almost offhand, that Priya had used some of that money for a rhinoplasty revision instead of headshots. I looked at Priya across the table. She didn't even flinch. She just said, "You wouldn't understand. You don't have to think about your face for a living." My father nodded like that settled it. Nobody asked me how I felt about being lied to. Nobody suggested she pay me back. I let it go because that's what I always did, and because $12,000, while it stung, wasn't going to break me. I think about that Thanksgiving now, and I recognize it for what it was. Not an isolated incident. A rehearsal. There was an earlier version of that same pattern, one I'd almost forgotten until all of this dragged it back up. In 2011, the summer after I finished my computer science degree at UC Davis, I was accepted into a highly competitive 12-week fellowship in Seattle, one of only 30 spots out of more than 4,000 applicants, the kind of program that ends up on a resume and actually means something to the people reading it. I called my parents the day I found out, genuinely thrilled, expecting some version of the excitement I'd seen them show for Priya's local print campaigns. My mother's first response was to ask if the program conflicted with Priya's engagement party, which had been scheduled for the same July. It didn't, as it turned out, but the fact that it was the first first question told me everything about where my news ranked. My father asked, not unkindly, but not with much interest either, whether the fellowship paid a stipend, and when I said it did, modest but real, he said that was good, practical, and moved the conversation along to something else within a minute. I went to Seattle that summer anyway. Nobody visited. Nobody asked how it went beyond a single obligatory question at the next family dinner, where Priya's engagement, 3 states away and still 4 months out, dominated 90 minutes of conversation. I don't say this to suggest I was owed a parade. I say it because it taught me early, in a way I didn't fully understand until years later, that my accomplishments in that family were treated as private, personal satisfactions, while Priya's were treated as shared family currency, something everyone got to celebrate and claim a piece of. It's a small distinction. It shapes a person more than you'd expect. For most of my adult life, my relationship with Priya operated on an unspoken rule. What was mine was negotiable, and what was hers was not. I paid for half of her wedding dress alterations in 2016. I covered 3 months of her car payment during a slow stretch in 2018 when Victor was between funds. When Sophie was born, I flew to Los Angeles 4 times in her first year, sat through 2 a.m. feedings so Priya could sleep, and never once heard a thank you that didn't come with a comment about how easy it must be for me, since I didn't have kids of my own to worry about. I told myself that was just how Priya talked. I told myself under the sharp edges there was still a sister who loved me. I believed that, mostly, right up until the week in January 2024, when Sophie's eye started to hurt. It started as what everyone assumed was pink eye. Sophie had been wearing decorative contact lenses for a school play, cheap ones ordered online, and within 4 days her left eye was red and swollen and she couldn't tolerate light. Priya took her to an urgent care in Culver City, then to an ophthalmologist, and by the 3rd appointment the diagnosis had a name that none of us had ever heard before: acanthamoeba keratitis, a rare parasitic infection that had scarred the surface of Sophie's cornea badly enough that her vision in that eye had dropped to something close to legal blindness. The specialist told them a corneal transplant was the only path back to normal vision. Without it, Sophie would likely lose functional sight in that eye permanently. I found out about all of this secondhand through my mother, 4 days after Sophie's diagnosis. Priya hadn't called me herself. She'd been busy, apparently, researching donor compatibility, and by the time she finally did call, on that Saturday morning in February, she wasn't calling to tell me my niece was sick. She was calling to tell me what I owed her. The calls didn't stop after that first Saturday. They came every day for the next 2 weeks, sometimes twice a day, always with a new argument, like she was working through a list. I started to recognize the pattern the way you recognize a sales script. Priya never repeated an approach that had already failed. She just moved to the next one. The first argument was professional necessity. She sent me a link to an article about depth perception and modeling, insisted that losing an eye would end her career outright, that photographers could tell, that agencies could tell, that nobody hired models with any kind of visible asymmetry. I pointed out that a corneal transplant in someone else, meaning me, had nothing to do with her own eyes at all. She ignored the logic entirely and moved on to the next argument 2 days later, like the first one had landed exactly the way she wanted. The second argument was comparative suffering. She told me I didn't understand what it was like to have a body that was constantly evaluated, constantly photographed, constantly picked apart by strangers online. She said I got to hide behind a screen all day, that nobody scrutinized my face in high resolution, that I had the luxury of being invisible. I told her I didn't consider being unbothered a luxury I needed to apologize for. She told me I was being dismissive of her pain. The third argument was comparative need. This was the one that stuck with me longest, because it was the one my mother eventually repeated back to me, almost word for word. Priya said I was 35 and single, with no children, no partner, nobody who needed to look at my face and love it. She said I didn't need to attract anyone, didn't need to compete for anything, didn't need both eyes the way she did, the way Sophie would someday. She said it so plainly, so certain of its own logic, that for a moment I actually sat with the words and tried to find the version of myself where they might be true. Then I got angry instead, which I think was the healthier response. By the second week of February, my mother had joined the calls. She didn't ask me how I was doing. She didn't ask how work was going, or whether I'd been sleeping, or anything at all about my life. She opened with, "Emma, your sister's whole career supports this family. You only have to support yourself." I asked her what that was supposed to mean. She said Victor's income was inconsistent, that Priya's modeling contracts filled the gaps, that if Priya lost an eye and lost her bookings, there would be real financial consequences that would ripple out to everyone, including my parents' retirement fund, which Priya apparently contributed to. I hadn't known that. I still don't know if it was true or if it was something Priya had told my mother to raise the stakes. My father called 2 days after that. He is not a man who calls often. When he does, it usually means something specific has been decided and he's been assigned to deliver it. He told me I needed to step up, that being an aunt meant more than showing up for birthdays, that real family showed up when it cost something. I asked him calmly whether he would consider donating a cornea if he were the match instead of me. There was a long pause on the line. Then he said his eyes weren't as healthy as mine, that at 68 his corneas probably wouldn't be viable anyway, that it made more sense for a younger donor. I asked if he'd actually been tested. He admitted he hadn't. Neither had my mother. Neither, as far as I could tell, had anyone except me. me. That's when Victor entered the picture directly. Up to that point, he'd stayed quiet, which I'd assumed meant he disagreed with his wife, or at least felt uncomfortable with how she was handling it. I was wrong. He texted me a series of articles about living successfully with monocular vision, cheerful blog posts written by people who'd lost an eye to cancer or trauma, all of them framed like inspirational proof that I had nothing to lose. When I didn't respond the way he wanted, he called me directly. "I know this is a lot to ask," he said. His voice was careful, businesslike, the same tone I imagine he uses when he's trying to close a deal with a nervous investor. "But we want to make it worth your while. $50,000. That's not nothing." I remember exactly where I was standing when he said it, in the doorway of my home office, one hand braced on the frame. $50,000, offered like a signing bonus, like my cornea was a used car part with a fair market price. "You're offering to buy my eye," I said. "I'm offering to compensate you for a sacrifice," he said. "That's how the world works, Emma. Nobody does something for nothing. Sophie's mother could do it for nothing. She's the one match who wouldn't need compensation because she's her mother." Victor didn't have an answer for that. He just repeated that the offer stood, that I should think about what $50,000 could do for someone in my position. And I understood in that moment that he saw my life the same way Priya did. Small, insufficient, a life that existed to be drawn on when theirs needed resources. I told him I'd think about it, mostly to end the call. I had no intention of taking the money, but refusing outright in that moment felt like it would only accelerate whatever came next, and I wanted time to figure out what I was actually dealing with. What came next was worse than anything Victor's articles or my mother's guilt or my father's disappointment had managed. 2 weeks into February, Priya recruited reinforcements. My Aunt Divya, my mother's older sister, called me from Fresno, a woman I hadn't spoken to in maybe 3 years, and delivered a version of the same argument, clearly briefed beforehand. A family friend named Ritu, someone I'd known since childhood, messaged me on Instagram, saying she'd heard what was happening and couldn't believe I was being so cold about a 9-year-old's eyesight. I didn't know how many people Priya had told, or what version of the story she'd given them, but it was clear the version circulating did not include the part where she'd refused to be tested herself. I noticed something small during this stretch that I didn't think much of at the time. I'd driven down to Los Angeles the second weekend of February, mostly to see Sophie, partly because I thought being in the same room as my sister might make the conversation feel less abstract, less like a war being fought over the phone. Priya met me at the door of her house in Culver City wearing sunglasses, the wraparound kind, even though it was overcast and we were standing in her own dim entryway. She kept them on the entire visit, even at dinner, even under the kitchen lights. When I asked about it, she said her eyes were sensitive that week, some kind of allergy flare-up, and changed the subject before I could ask anything else. I noticed a folded appointment card on her kitchen counter, the letterhead for an ophthalmology practice in Beverly Hills, a name I didn't recognize, dated for later that month. I assumed it had something to do with Sophie's case and didn't think about it again. There was one more step before Sophie's voice message, one I almost left out of this account because it embarrasses me a little, how long it took me to see it for what it was. On February 17th, Priya added me to a family group chat she'd created called Sophie's Journey, a name that made my stomach turn the first time I saw it. The chat included my parents, my Aunt Divya, 2 cousins I rarely spoke to, and, strangely, Ritu, the family friend who wasn't actually family at all. Priya posted a photo of Sophie in a hospital gown, taken during one of her early appointments, her small face turned toward the camera, one eye swollen and red, captioned only with a single crying emoji. Under the photo, she wrote, "Waiting to see if anyone in this family loves her enough to help." No names, no direct accusation. She didn't need one. Everyone in that chat knew exactly who the message was aimed at, because I was the only person in the group who hadn't yet said yes. The responses came fast. My Aunt Divya wrote, "Praying for a miracle donor in this family soon." One cousin sent a string of heart emojis. Ritu wrote, "Sending Sophie so much love, she deserves this." And then, a few minutes later, a separate message just to the group. "Is there really no match yet? I thought family usually stepped up for this kind of thing." Nobody asked why Priya, Sophie's own mother, wasn't listed as the obvious candidate. Nobody asked a single medical question. The photo of my niece's swollen eye sat at the top of that chat for days, doing exactly the work Priya intended it to do, turning a private medical decision into a public referendum on my character, conducted entirely without my consent, in front of an audience she'd curated specifically to apply pressure. I left the chat on February 19th without responding to a single message in it. Priya added me back twice. I left it twice more before she finally stopped. The moment everything changed happened on a Tuesday night, the 20th of February. I was in the middle of a code review at work when my phone buzzed with a voice message from an unfamiliar audio file, sent through Priya's number. I opened it in the break room, expecting another argument from my sister. It was Sophie's voice instead. She was crying, the kind of crying that comes from real fear, not performance. Except the words underneath the fear were too precise for a 9-year-old, too structured, clearly fed to her line by line. "Aunt Emma," she said, her breath catching, "why don't you love me enough to help me see again? Mommy said you don't care if I go blind." Then more crying, real and raw, the kind that made my chest physically hurt to listen to, followed by a small, exhausted, "Please, Aunt Emma, please." I stood in the break room at Meridian Systems and listened to that message 4 times, and something in me went very quiet quiet and very still. The same stillness I remembered from the kitchen that first Saturday, except colder now and sharper. I wasn't angry in the way I had been with Victor or my father. This was different. This was the moment I stopped being someone my sister could wear down and started being someone building a case. I didn't call Priya that night. I didn't call anyone. I sat in my car in the Meridian parking garage for 40 minutes after my shift ended, and I thought about the appointment card on her kitchen counter, and the sunglasses she wouldn't take off, and the $12,000 from 2019 that never came back to me, and the $50,000 offer that treated my body like inventory, and I made a decision. If my sister wanted to fight this with lies dressed up as love, I was going to fight it with facts. The next morning, I called Vantage Model Management. I didn't call to complain. I called with a single question, phrased as plainly as I could manage because I wanted an answer that couldn't be spun into another argument later. I got transferred twice before I reached a woman named Carol Ashwood, who identified herself as Priya's booking manager and account lead. I introduced myself as Priya's sister and told her I had a compliance question about client policy. Would a model on your roster lose contracts for donating a cornea to her own child? I asked. Not a stranger, her daughter. Would that end her career? There was a pause on the line, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. I'm sorry, Carol said. Can you repeat the question? I repeated it. I kept my voice level. I'd practiced this in the car on the drive to work, wanting to sound like someone asking a factual question, not someone launching an attack. Of course not, Carol said, and I could hear something shift in her tone, confusion sliding into something sharper. That would be discrimination, first of all, and frankly, it would probably generate positive press for her. Clients love a story like that. Why would you ask me this? I told her. I told her about the phone calls, the $50,000 offer, the argument about depth perception and career-ending asymmetry, the voice message from a crying 9-year-old that had been recorded and sent to guilt a 35-year-old aunt into major surgery. I kept my account factual, almost clinical, the way I'd present a bug report at work, because I knew if I let any real emotion into it, it would sound like exaggeration instead of what it was. Carol was quiet for a long moment after I finished. She told her family that donating an organ would end her career, Carol said slowly, like she was testing the sentence for herself as much as for me. She told her own daughter's aunt that, to avoid donating to her own sick child. That's what I've been hearing for 3 weeks, I said. Carol stopped herself. When she spoke again, her voice had gone cold and professional. I need to be honest with you. That's not something this agency would ever support, and it's not true. We've had clients with visible scarring, clients who've had reconstructive surgery, clients who model specifically because of a distinctive feature, not despite one. Nobody here would drop Priya over something like this. If anything, refusing to help her own daughter would be a much bigger reputational problem than any surgery could ever be. She told me she'd need to speak with Priya directly, that she wanted to make sure the agency's position was represented accurately, since it had apparently been misrepresented to an entire family for weeks. I told her that was her call to make. I hung up feeling something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not yet, just a strange, hollow relief, like I'd finally set down something heavy I'd been carrying without realizing how much it weighed. Carol called Priya that same afternoon. I don't know exactly what was said. I know it wasn't gentle, because within 2 hours my phone had 15 new messages from my sister, arriving in bursts, each one angrier than the last. You had no right to call my agency. Do you have any idea what you've done? This is my career, my life. You don't get to interfere. I can't believe you would do this to me, to your own sister. You are so jealous of me, it's actually pathetic. You've always resented that I got the looks in this family and you got nothing. I hope you're happy. I hope ruining my life made you feel powerful. I read every message twice. I noticed, the way you notice a pattern once you're finally looking for it, that not one of them mentioned Sophie. Not one asked whether I was doing better, worse, closer to a decision. Not one acknowledged that she'd lied to an entire family for 3 weeks to avoid a medical procedure her own daughter needed. Every message was about what I had cost Priya. Nothing about what her lie had cost Sophie. I took a screenshot of each one and saved them to a folder on my laptop labeled simply Priya. I didn't know yet what I'd need them for. I just knew, with a clarity that surprised me, that I would need them for something. Victor called that evening. His voice was different than it had been during the $50,000 call. Quieter, more hollow, like something had gone out of him. Carol called Priya today, he said. I only just found out the whole story wasn't what she told me either. What did she tell you? That you were the one who was refusing to even consider it. That you'd made it about money? That you wanted compensation before you'd think about helping Sophie at all? He paused. That's not what actually happened, is it? No, I said. That's not what happened. He was quiet for a while. Are you satisfied now? He finally asked. You've humiliated her. Her manager thinks she's a liar. Is that what you wanted? I'll be satisfied, I said. The day Sophie gets the cornea she needs from her actual mother, the way this should have happened in January, before any of this. He hung up without saying anything else. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after that, looking at Bishop asleep on the kitchen floor, wondering if I'd just made everything worse, wondering if exposing a lie was the same thing as fixing one. I didn't have an answer yet. I wouldn't for another 4 days. My mother called 2 days after that, on a Thursday, and her voice sounded different too, smaller. She told me she'd called Vantage herself, spoken to Carol directly, verified everything I'd said. Her apology, when it came, was fast and clipped, the kind of apology that's really an attempt to close a subject rather than sit inside it. She said she was sorry for how things had gotten gotten out of hand, never quite landing on what exactly she was sorry for, never mentioning the specific words she'd used on the phone with me, the ones about how Priya's career supported the family, and mine only supported myself. I told her I needed some time before I was ready to talk to her regularly again. She didn't argue. I think some part of her already understood why. Priya went quiet for almost a week after that. No calls, no texts, no messages relayed through my parents. I told myself it was over, that the pressure campaign had finally collapsed under its own weight, that maybe, somewhere in the silence, she was actually reconsidering her own testing. I was wrong about all of it, though not in the way I expected. The call came on a Wednesday morning, the last day of February, from a number I didn't recognize with a Los Angeles area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me pick up. "Is this Emma Kapoor?" a man's voice asked. "My name is Dr. Reese. I'm a transplant coordinator with Cedars-Sinai. I'm calling about Sophie Ferris." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. "I'm listening. I wanted to check in and see if you'd still be willing to move forward with an evaluation as a potential backup donor," he said. "I know things have been complicated on the family side. I just want to make sure we have accurate information before we proceed." Something about the word backup caught in my chest. Backup to what? I thought Priya was still refusing to be tested. There was a small pause, the kind that told me he was choosing his next words carefully. "Your name has actually been on file with our office for a few weeks now," he said. "Since late January. Priya listed you as a potential donor on the initial intake paperwork." I sat very still. She listed me in January, before she ever called to ask me. "That's correct," Dr. Reese said. "I assumed you were aware. I apologize if this is coming as a surprise." It was more than a surprise. It was a small, quiet detonation somewhere behind my sternum, the kind of anger that doesn't shout, just settles in and stays. My sister had written my name on a hospital form before she had asked me a single question, before the phone calls, before the $50,000, before Sophie's coached voice message. She hadn't been negotiating with me for 3 weeks. She had been managing me, the way you manage an asset you already believe belongs to you, working through a script designed to get me to a decision she considered a foregone conclusion. I nearly threw my phone across the kitchen. I didn't. I took a breath instead, the kind of breath I use before a difficult meeting at work, and I told Dr. Reese I would come in for the evaluation, but only for Sophie, I said, and only on my terms, not my sister's. "Understood," he said. "I'll set it up for early next week." The testing took 3 days. Blood work, imaging, a full corneal topography scan, a review of my ocular history going back to childhood. Every result came back better than I expected. Better, as it turned out, than anyone in my family had anticipated. My corneas were healthy, evenly curved, free of the kind of microscopic irregularities that sometimes disqualify a donor. Dr. Reese told me, almost with surprise in his voice, that mine were some of the cleanest scans he'd seen that month. Then, 4 days later, he called again, and this time, his voice had a different weight to it. "I have some information I need to share with you," he said. "It concerns your sister's own testing. I thought she refused to be tested. She didn't refuse in the end," he said. "Once the agency situation became public within the family, she came in for an evaluation of her own, quietly. I believe she was hoping to resolve things before anyone else needed to know the results. And her testing revealed early-stage keratoconus in both eyes. It's a progressive thinning of the cornea. It's degenerative, and in her case, it appears to have been present for at least 2 years, possibly longer, based on the pattern of scarring we found." He paused. "It's the kind of condition that would make her a significantly higher risk donor than initially believed. Frankly, given the progression we're seeing, I'm not sure her corneas would have been a safe option for Sophie at all, regardless of any other consideration." I thought immediately of the sunglasses in the dim entryway, the appointment card on the kitchen counter, the Beverly Hills letterhead I hadn't recognized, the sensitivity to light she'd waved off as an allergy. 2 years. She had known, or at least suspected for 2 years, and she had spent the last month telling an entire family that her eyes were too valuable to risk, when the truth was that her eyes had already been quietly failing her, in a way she hadn't told a single one of us. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up the phone. Not triumph again. Something closer to grief, strange and unexpected. Grief for the version of this story where my sister might have simply told the truth from the beginning. "I have a condition. I'm scared. I don't know if I can do this." I would have understood that. I might have even offered to be tested first, without a single argument, if she had simply been honest with me instead of turning me into a target. Instead, she had spent a month telling me my eyes meant nothing, while quietly, privately, guarding the truth about her own. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description for early access to new stories and better audio quality. Now back to the video. Dr. Reese scheduled a final consultation for the following Monday at Cedars-Sinai to review both sets of results with the family before deciding how to proceed with Sophie's transplant. I drove down from Denver on Sunday night and stayed in a hotel near the hospital, unwilling to spend one more evening under my sister's roof, listening to Victor's careful, business-like voice try to smooth over what everyone now understood had happened. The waiting room on the 3rd floor of the outpatient surgical building was small, maybe 6 chairs, a low table with old magazines nobody was reading, fluorescent light that made everyone look slightly ill. My parents flew in from Sacramento and arrived first, my mother sitting rigid in her chair, my father staring at his phone without actually looking at it. Victor arrived next, alone. Sophie left at home with a babysitter for this particular conversation. Priya came last. dressed, 7 minutes late, wearing the same wraparound sunglasses I'd seen in her entryway 3 weeks earlier, even though we were sitting under hospital lighting with no windows in sight. Nobody said much while we waited. My mother asked if I'd eaten. I said yes. My father cleared his throat twice and said nothing. Priya sat 2 chairs away from me, arms crossed, staring at the floor, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she wasn't talking. I found the silence almost unbearable, worse in some ways than the barrage of calls had been, because at least the calls had given me something to respond to. This just sat in the room with us, heavy and unresolved. Dr. Reese came out at 9:40, holding 2 folders, and asked if we could all step into a consultation room down the hall. It was a small space with a round table and too many chairs crowded around it. He sat at the head of the table and set both folders down in front of him, and I watched Priya's hand tighten on the strap of her bag. "I want to walk through where things stand," he said, "so everyone has the same information." He started with Sophie. Her cornea, damaged by the infection, needed to be replaced within the next 6 to 8 weeks to preserve the best chance of restored vision. Waiting longer risked permanent, more severe vision loss. He explained the matching criteria, tissue compatibility, the surgical timeline. Then he opened the first folder. "Emma's testing came back excellent," he said. "Strong compatibility, healthy tissue, no disqualifying factors. She would be an excellent donor for Sophie." My mother let out a small breath I hadn't realized she'd been holding. My father nodded once, like he was filing the information away. Then Dr. Reese opened the second folder, and the room went very quiet. "Priya's testing showed early-stage keratoconus in both eyes," he said, his voice even and clinical, the voice of someone who has delivered difficult information many times and has learned not to soften it into something less true than it is. "Based on the corneal thinning pattern, this has likely been progressing for at least 2 years. Given that progression, Priya would not be a recommended donor. The risk to both her own long-term vision and to the recipient would be significant." Nobody spoke. Victor turned slowly in his chair to look at his wife. My mother's mouth opened and then closed again. Priya stared at the folder on the table like it had personally betrayed her. 2 years, my father said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to do. Dr. Reese looked down at his notes, then back up, and this time he looked past Priya entirely. He looked straight at me. "Emma," he said, "given everything we've reviewed, you're the strongest match available for Sophie, and frankly, the safest option by a wide margin. If you're still willing, I'd like to move forward with you as the primary donor." Nobody in that room said the sentence out loud, but everyone heard it anyway. Underneath his clinical language, the sister who had spent a month insisting her eyes were too valuable to spare had been quietly hiding a diagnosis that made the entire argument a lie from the start. Not a difficult decision she'd been avoiding. A fabrication built to protect a secret she hadn't wanted anyone to know. Priya finally spoke, her voice tight, high, cracking at the edges. You're making it sound like I lied. I didn't know for sure. I wasn't sure until— You've been wearing sunglasses indoors for months," I said. It was the first thing I'd said since we sat down. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "You had an appointment card on your kitchen counter in February from an ophthalmologist in Beverly Hills. I saw it. I didn't think anything of it, because I trusted you enough not to think you were hiding something like this from your own family while you asked me to give up an eye. You don't understand what it's like to be scared of losing your career, Emma. You've never had to—" "I understand being scared," I said. "What I don't understand is why being scared meant you had to make Sophie call me crying, coached, to tell me I didn't love her. What I don't understand is why being scared meant Victor offered me $50,000 like I was a body part for sale. What I don't understand is why you wrote my name on a hospital form in January and never once asked me a real question, just told me what I owed you." Victor was quiet, his jaw tight, looking at his wife like he was seeing her from a distance for the first time in years. "You could have told us the truth," my mother said to Priya, her voice thin. "Any of it. At any point. I didn't want you to know I was scared," Priya said. And for 1 second, just one, her voice cracked into something that sounded almost like the sister I remembered from before all of this, before the calls, before the calculated silences. "I didn't want to be the one who was falling apart. I've always had to be the strong one, the one who has it together." "You didn't have to be strong," I said quietly. "You had to be honest. That's all any of this ever needed." Nobody argued with that, not even Priya. Dr. Reese, with the careful discretion of a man who has watched a lot of families come apart in small conference rooms, said he would give us a few minutes and stepped out into the hallway, and the 6 of us sat there, in the sudden, ringing quiet, looking at a version of my sister that the rest of the family was finally seeing without her sunglasses on. I agreed to move forward as the primary donor before I left the hospital that day. I want to be clear about why, because it would have been easy for people watching this unfold to assume I did it to prove something, to win some final round in a fight that had gone on for a month. That's not why. I did it because Sophie was 9 years old and scared and losing her vision, and none of what her mother had done was her fault. Nothing about that had ever been in question for me. Not once. Not during the worst of the phone calls. Not during the voice message that still made my stomach turn when I thought about it. The fight had always been with Priya. My answer for Sophie had never actually wavered. The surgery was scheduled for the 3rd week of March. In the 6 weeks between that consultation room and the operating room, the rest of the family didn't so much take sides as slowly, unevenly, come to terms with what they'd been part of. My father surprised me the most. 2 days after the hospital meeting, he called me me, and instead of the careful, conflict-averse tone he usually took, he told me he was ashamed of how he'd handled the whole situation. He said he'd let Priya's version of events become his own without ever questioning it, the same way he had for 30 years, and that watching Dr. Reese lay out the two folders side by side had been the first time in a long time he'd actually looked at the facts instead of at his own comfort with not looking. He apologized for the comment about stepping up, told me he understood now what he'd actually been asking me to sacrifice for a story that wasn't even true. It wasn't a perfect apology. He's not a man built for long emotional conversations, and he stumbled through most of it, but it was more honesty than I'd gotten from him in years, and I found myself unexpectedly grateful for it. My mother took longer. She called every few days through March, mostly small talk, mostly avoiding the actual subject, until finally, about 2 weeks before the surgery, she admitted the thing that I think had been sitting under all of it the whole time. She told me that she'd always found it easier to advocate for Priya because Priya asked loudly and often, and I never had. She said somewhere along the way, she'd mistaken my not asking for not needing, and that she saw now how much damage that mistake had done, not just in this instance, but across our whole lives. I told her I appreciated her saying it. I didn't tell her it fixed anything because it didn't, not immediately. Some things take longer to repair than a single honest phone call can manage, but it was a start, and I was willing to let it be a start. Victor's reaction was the most complicated. In the days after the hospital meeting, he stopped defending Priya publicly, at least around me, but he also didn't leave her, which some part of me had quietly expected. What he did instead was quieter and in its own way, more damning. He told me during a brief call in early March that he'd gone back through their finances after the consultation and found 2 appointments with the Beverly Hills ophthalmologist, dating back 14 months. Both paid out of an account Priya managed separately from their joint one, both listed on the statement under a vague code that hadn't caught his attention until he went looking. He said he'd confronted her about it, and she'd admitted she'd suspected something was wrong with her eyes for over a year, had been managing occasional blurred vision and light sensitivity privately, terrified that a diagnosis would end the only career she'd ever known. He told me their marriage counselor now had a lot more material to work with than either of them had planned on bringing in. He didn't sound angry when he told me this. He sounded tired, the particular tiredness of a man realizing he'd been managing a version of his wife that she'd carefully constructed for him, rather than the actual person underneath it. Priya's professional life took its own turn, separate from the family fallout. Carol Ashwood, true to what she'd told me on the phone in February, hadn't dropped Priya from the agency roster, but word travels in small industries, and by late March, a version of the story had circulated among a handful of other clients, and a photographer Priya had worked with regularly. Nobody published anything. Nothing became a headline or a viral post, and I want to be honest that I never wanted that. Never leaked anything to anyone outside the family. Never sent those screenshots anywhere but the folder on my laptop where I'd saved them out of instinct rather than intent. But 2 bookings quietly fell through that spring, and Carol told Priya, gently but plainly, that a story about a mother refusing to help her sick daughter, dressed up as career protection, was not the kind of narrative any brand wanted attached to their campaign, regardless of how the internal facts eventually sorted themselves out. Priya's income dropped noticeably that year. I never felt the satisfaction in that I might have expected. Mostly I just felt tired and a little sad, the way you feel watching a slow-moving accident you predicted but couldn't prevent. There was a legal complication nobody had anticipated, one that added its own strange bureaucratic texture to an already exhausting spring. Because Sophie was a minor, the hospital required consent from both parents for the transplant procedure, and Priya, even after everything, initially balked at signing off on a surgery that used my cornea instead of her own, citing vague concerns about outside donor risk that Dr. Reese quietly assured me had no medical basis. It took 2 additional consultations, and eventually a conversation between Victor and a family law attorney to clarify that Priya's continued hesitation, absent any medical justification, could be interpreted as a failure to act in Sophie's best interest, language that apparently frightened her into signing within 48 hours. I don't know if she was protecting some last shred of control, or if some part of her genuinely couldn't stomach watching me succeed where she'd failed, or if it was something else entirely that I'll never fully understand. I've stopped trying to find a single clean explanation for my sister's behavior. People are rarely that simple, even when they've hurt you. Around the same time, I made a decision that felt small at the moment but mattered more than I expected. A colleague at Meridian, a woman named Preeti, who'd gone through her own ugly family situation a few years back, suggested I talk to an actual attorney about the screenshots I'd saved, not to threaten anyone, but to understand where I stood if Priya ever tried to claim I'd defamed her by talking about what happened. I met with a family law attorney in downtown Denver for an hour in early March, mostly out of caution. She reviewed the messages, the voice memo, the timeline I'd written out for myself, and told me plainly that documenting everything accurately, without exaggeration, was the single smartest thing I'd done through the entire ordeal. She said most people in situations like mine reacted purely on emotion and left themselves with nothing but a story nobody could verify later. I'd built, without fully meaning to, a factual record. It gave me a strange, steadying kind of confidence going into the final weeks before the surgery. The sense that whatever happened next, I wasn't standing on nothing. Sophie started seeing a child psychologist that spring as well, something Victor arranged quietly, separate from the custody and consent complications. After Dr. Reese gently suggested it might help her process everything she'd been asked to say and feel over the preceding weeks. I only learned the details secondhand through Victor, who told me the psychologist believed Sophie had internalized a confusing message, that her aunt's love was something she had to actively earn through visible, performed suffering, rather than something that simply existed for her regardless. It broke something in me, hearing that, more than almost anything else that happened that spring. A 9-year-old shouldn't have to learn that lesson about anyone, let alone about someone who loved her as uncomplicatedly as I did. It made the eventual surgery feel even more necessary, not as a resolution to the fight with Priya, but as a way of finally, concretely, proving to Sophie that the love had never needed to be coerced out of anyone in the first place. Dana flew out to Los Angeles the week of my surgery, unannounced, and showed up at my hotel room with a bag of groceries and a stack of trashy magazines, the kind of gesture that meant more to me than almost anything else that happened during that stretch. She sat with me through the mildest of the recovery discomfort, made sure I ate actual meals instead of hospital cafeteria snacks, and didn't ask me to talk about my sister once, unless I brought it up myself. On the second night, we sat on the small hotel balcony with the city lights spread out below us, and she asked gently whether I thought I'd ever trust Priya again. I told her I didn't know. I still don't, fully, even now. But I told her that trusting Priya again wasn't actually the question I needed answered anymore. The question I needed answered was whether I could trust myself to recognize this pattern earlier next time, in any relationship, family, or otherwise, before it cost me another $12,000, or another month of my life, or another piece of my body offered up under pressure instead of freely given. Dana didn't have an answer for that either. She just refilled my water glass and told me I already had, by picking up the phone and calling that agency instead of caving to $50,000 and a coached voice message. I think she was right. I think that phone call to Carol Ashwood was the moment I actually started trusting myself again, maybe for the first time in years where my sister was involved. There was a night in early March, about a week before the surgery, when I sat on my back porch in Denver with Bishop curled against my leg and let myself grieve, properly, for the first time since the whole thing started. Not for my eye. I was never afraid of the surgery itself, and the recovery, when it came, was easier than I expected. I grieved for the sister I thought I had, the one I'd told myself existed underneath the sharp comments and the borrowed money and the years of small, accumulated unfairness. I'd spent so long explaining her away, telling myself she loved me in her own limited way, that I hadn't let myself see, until that consultation room in Los Angeles, how much of that love had always been conditional on what I could provide. I cried harder than I expected to that night, not because I was surprised by what I'd learned, but because some stubborn part of me had kept hoping I was wrong. I called an old friend from college that night, someone I hadn't spoken to in almost a year, just to hear a voice that had nothing to do with any of it. Her name is Dana, and she'd been the maid of honor at a wedding I never had, the person who'd driven 6 hours to help me move into my first apartment in Denver 11 years ago. And when I told her the short version of what had happened, she went quiet for a long moment and then said something I've held on to since. "You don't owe anyone your body just because you share their blood," she said. "Love isn't a debt collection service." I wrote that down in my phone that night, in a notes app I don't usually use for anything sentimental, because I didn't want to lose the shape of it. Sophie's surgery took place on the 19th of March at Cedars-Sinai. I went in for my own procedure 2 days earlier, an outpatient corneal harvesting performed under careful surgical protocol, and I spent most of that week in a hotel near the hospital, managing mild discomfort and a strange, tender awareness of my own eye that faded within days. I wasn't in the operating room when they transplanted the tissue into Sophie, obviously, but Victor sent me updates throughout the procedure, and I sat in a different waiting room than the one where the consultation had happened, this one with better light, and a coffee machine that actually worked. And I thought about how strange it was that the actual medical act, the thing that had caused a month of screaming and lies and $50,000 offers, turned out to be almost anticlimactic, once it was finally happening honestly, without an agenda attached to it. The surgery went well. Dr. Reese called Victor that evening to say the graft had taken cleanly, that early signs were good, that Sophie would need follow-up visits over the coming months, but that her prognosis for meaningful vision restoration in that eye was strong. I cried again that night, a different kind of crying than the porch a week earlier. Relief this time, something close to peace. Priya visited me once, briefly, in the recovery unit before I was discharged. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before coming in, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. "Thank you," she said. "For Sophie, not for me. I know that. I did it for her," I said. "You should know that, too." She nodded. She didn't apologize. Not fully. Not in the way that would have felt like an actual reckoning with everything she'd done. I don't think she was capable of that yet, and maybe she never will be. But she said one more thing before she left the room, quiet, almost to herself. "I don't know how to be scared out loud," she said. "I never learned how. I didn't have an answer for that. Some truths just sit in a room with you, unresolved, and you let them." It's been 16 months since that spring. I'm writing this from the same kitchen in Denver where I stood the morning Priya first called, the same counter where I set my coffee down too hard and watched it spill without moving to clean it up. Bishop is older now, grayer around the muzzle, rehearsal, still sleeping in the same spot by the back door. My life looks, from the outside, almost exactly like it did before any of this happened. I still lead my team at Meridian Systems. I still pay my mortgage on time. I still run the same loop through the park, 2 blocks from my house most mornings before work. But something underneath all of it shifted permanently that spring, and I don't think I'll ever go back to who I was before it. My vision is fine. I want to say that plainly, because I know it's the practical question most people ask first. There were a few weeks of adjustment after the corneal harvesting, some mild dryness, a follow-up appointment or two, and then my eye settled back into its normal function, exactly the way the surgical team told me it would. I never lost anything measurable. I gave up tissue my body could spare, to a child who needed it far more than I did, and my life continued on, essentially unchanged in every practical sense. I think that fact surprised people when I told the story afterward, the ones who assumed I'd sacrificed something dramatic and permanent. I didn't. What I actually lost that spring wasn't in my body at all. Sophie is 10 now. Her vision in the transplanted eye has stabilized at close to normal, well enough that her ophthalmologist cleared her for regular sports again last fall, well enough that she plays soccer on Saturdays in a league near Culver City and sends me videos of her goals, unprompted, because somewhere in the last year she decided I was someone worth sharing that with. I fly out to see her every couple of months now. I've never once told her the details of what happened between her mother and me that winter. She's 10. She doesn't need to carry that weight, and honestly, some of it isn't mine to hand her. What she knows is that Aunt Emma gave her an eye when she needed one, and that Aunt Emma shows up, reliably, in a way that apparently used to be rare in our family before all of this forced everyone to recalibrate what showing up actually meant. My relationship with Priya exists now in a smaller, more honest shape than it did before. We're not close, not the way people mean when they use that word to describe sisters. We talk maybe once a month, mostly logistics around Sophie, birthdays, and school events, and the occasional shared holiday that our parents still insist on hosting. She's never given me the full apology I think some younger version of myself would have wanted, the kind where she sits across from me and names every specific thing she did and asks for forgiveness point by point. I've made a kind of peace with the fact that she may never be capable of that. What I have instead is an uneasy, functional distance, built on the understanding that I will always show up for Sophie, and that Priya no longer gets to assume anything from me beyond that. It's not the relationship I wanted growing up. It's the one that's actually true. And I found there's a strange relief in finally living inside something true instead of something performed. Her modeling career survived, in a diminished form. She still books work, mostly regional campaigns now, fewer national contracts than before. And I've heard through my mother that she started doing some skincare content on social media instead, talking openly, ironically, about aging and insecurity, and the pressure to look a certain way for a living. I don't watch it. I don't feel entitled to an opinion on how she's chosen to rebuild her income. And honestly, some part of me hopes it's working out for her, the way you hope things work out for someone you used to love uncomplicatedly, even after they've shown you exactly how conditional that love could become under pressure. My parents are different with me now too, in ways I notice mostly in small moments. My father calls more often, actual calls, not just logistics relayed through my mother. He asked, unprompted, about a promotion I was up for at work last spring, something he never would have thought to ask about before, when Priya's bookings and casting calls were the only professional news that ever seemed to register in that house. My mother sent me a card on the anniversary of the surgery this March, just a small note that said she was proud of who I was, not who I'd been asked to be. I keep it in a drawer in my office. I don't know if I've fully forgiven either of them yet. I don't know if forgiveness is even the right word for what I'm working toward, but I believe they see me more clearly now than they did before, and for a family like ours, that counts as real progress. I started dating someone last autumn, a structural engineer named Marcus, who I met, of all places, at a co-working space downtown where I sometimes go to escape the quiet of my own house. He knows the whole story. I told him early, deliberately, partly as a kind of test I didn't fully admit to myself I was running. I wanted to see how someone reacted to hearing that I'd once been asked to give up an eye for a family member's vanity, whether he'd find it dramatic or unbelievable, or somehow my fault for letting it go on as long as it did. He didn't do any of that. He just asked how I was doing now and meant it, and that turned out to be the only test that mattered. I got my team's promotion cycle results back this past June, the one my father had asked about the year before, and I made principal engineer, the youngest person at Meridian to hit that title in the company's history. I called my parents that evening. My father asked real questions this time, about what the role actually involved, about whether it meant more travel, whether I was excited or just relieved. My mother asked if I was proud of myself, which is a question she'd never once asked me before that spring, not about anything. I told her I was. It felt strange to say out loud, and it felt true, and I've been trying, in the months since, to let those two things sit together more often, instead of treating pride as something I had to earn permission for. Dana still calls every few weeks now, a habit that started that March in the hotel room and never quite stopped. Preeti and I got closer too, after everything, close enough that she stood up at a small dinner I hosted this spring, close enough that she knows the whole story without me ever having to explain the parts that used to feel too complicated to say out loud. I've come to think the family you build around yourself, deliberately, one honest relationship at a time, matters as much as the one you're born into, sometimes more. Nobody in that second kind of family ever asked me to prove my love with my own body. Nobody ever will. I think about that first phone call sometimes, standing in my kitchen with the coffee going cold, my sister's voice telling me my eyes meant nothing because I stared at a screen all day. I understand now that she wasn't entirely wrong about one thing, even if she meant it as an insult rather than an observation. My eyes never had to compete for anything. Nobody photographed them for a living. Nobody's income depended on their symmetry or their color or how they looked under studio lighting. But she was wrong about what that meant. My eyes weren't worth less because nobody was watching them. They were mine, fully and completely, in a way that had nothing to do with what they could earn or provide for anyone else. And in the end, that ownership was the only thing that let me choose to give something away freely, instead of having it taken from me by a story I never agreed to be part of. That's the part I keep coming back to. The part I think this whole ordeal was actually about, underneath the surgery and the lies and the $50,000 and the coached voice message from a scared 9-year-old. My sister spent a month insisting that what was mine was negotiable and what was hers was not. She was wrong about that too. I gave Sophie a cornea because I loved her, freely, without a script written for me in advance, without a form filled out before I'd been asked a real question. I never gave Priya what she demanded. I gave her daughter what she deserved, and those turned out to be two very different things entirely. There's a version of this story that ends with a bow on it. Everyone reconciled, my sister transformed by what she nearly lost. That's not what happened, and I've stopped waiting for it to. What actually happened is smaller and more honest than that, and I think, in the end, more true to how real families actually heal, if they heal at all. Something was lost that spring that I don't think will ever fully come back. A version of my sister I'd spent 30 years hoping was still in there somewhere, patient underneath the sharp edges, waiting for the right moment to show up. I don't think she's coming back. I've made my peace with that, slowly, on my own porch, with my dog beside me, one quiet evening at a time. My eyes never meant nothing. They just took a family crisis, and a stranger's honest question over the phone, and a hospital form filled out behind my back to finally prove it to the people who should have known it all along.